Kind of? What happened to some of those pictures that just didn't show up? It was just like, I think Peter could have sent all the projects. Oh, trying to walk.
What's that sound?
Oh, turn down the volume.
It's the rain. Next group is ready.
Thunderstorm.
Nice.
Everyone's scared yet.
Did you seriously?
Is our
You dressed
A+.
video
I
up?
just got dressed.
I just got dressed.
Peter,
This isn't my
Bummer. Do you have beef
where's Peter?
It's the whole romantic thing.
It's filming.
Okay. So, so that was just a little something to set the mood because we talked about the romantic characters and the romantic aesthetic in Frankenstein. So basically, kind of a brief overview of Romanticism. The elements of this literary movement revolve around nature, emotion, and a new way of being. These stories incorporate things like nature imagery, even when not in nature, the individual and collective imagination of something new, something better, something more pristine, the creation of a more perfect version of humanity and society, which ties into mysticism and illusionment, criticism of the norm, going against what's typically accepted and being new and different, and then having the main character be the driving force of the novel through their actions, beliefs, thoughts,
As opposed to the novel being like a place for the character serves.
The novel doesn't exist for the character exists for the novel.
Well, no, it's the other way around.
Other way around.
The novel exists for the character exists for the novel. The novel exists for the character to tell the story. The character doesn't exist for the novel. Okay, so this is your fault, right? No, this is my slide. Okay, so how does Frankenstein fall into romanticism? So nature and emotion. So Frankenstein and his creature can be found throughout the novel, wandering through the woods, through the mountains, through the glen, through all of nature that they are in, deliberating their varying emotional states. And you can see that depending on where they are, it reflects their emotional state, such as Frankenstein spends the majority of his wandering in the lush forests and the meadows and the lakes, where he's not as upset as the creature who spends most of his time in the mountains with the rocks, and he's in such this state of inner turmoil, which is reflected by the mountains. Frankenstein wants to create his own perfect being, just like criticism of the norm. He doesn't like the way that the society that he sees around him, and he wants to be like, I want to create a human that can be the best human. It can do good. It will be good and do all the right things and look the right way and so on. But the creature ends up being shunned by society because the creature does not fit in with society. Mysticism. The images created in the mind of Frankenstein and this monster of what should be and what could be are shattered by reality. Mysticism relies heavily on imagination. Frankenstein has all of these delusions of grandeur with his new creature. He will be a god to this new race of creatures, and he really wants that, but reality says no. Criticism of the norm. The creature is unlike any other being and therefore is shunned by the rest of society because he cannot find anyone that is like him, so he wants a mate who will be someone like him. And the main characters are the driving force of the novel. The novel exists so Frankenstein can tell his story and to warn everyone else about what happens when you try to play God. Frankenstein's own ambition and arrogance are the influencing factors of the entire plot.
Okay, so now we're moving into the psychoanalysis of characters. Starting with Frankenstein, we took kind of a Freudian approach, so you can't really see it because the image wasn't fantastic, but this is kind of a brief overview of Freud's iceberg theory. So you have the id, the ego, and the superego. The ego and the superego are semi-conscious, so you sort of understand what they are and you can kind of comprehend them, but your id is like your inner emotions that are untangible and you can't get to them. So basically, the whole point of the story is Frankenstein wants to be the hero. His ego drives his impulse and desire, and that leads to his downfall, which results in his intense guilt complex. So we first start with the quote, "Soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done, far more will I achieve. I will unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation." So here we see his ambition plainly. He has to be the one to do more, and he will be the one to do more. There's no question about it in his mind. Moving on, we kind of see a little bit of a shift in his mental state. He says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch with whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form, beautiful great God?" So we're starting to see that split in his emotions. He's still blinded by his arrogance, but he's beginning to feel that something isn't quite right, and maybe he shouldn't have done this. Moving on, in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit was let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Here we see the more morbid dialogue, and he starts to become aware of how his mistake has affected his life, and he's starting to hit that place of rock bottom. And then at the very end, he gets to the point where he listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not indeed, but in effect, was the true murderer, and he's finally reached that final pit of despair, and he feels responsible for his creature, and feels like he was the murderer himself.
Okay, psychoanalysis of the creature. So when you first meet the monster, you actually throughout the whole book, you feel pretty bad for him because his father rejected him, even though Frankenstein doesn't view himself as his father. But he plays the role of a victim throughout the entire story, and he wants to find all the beauty and the happiness in the world, because when he first wakes up, he's full of wonder. He looks at the moon and wonders how something could be so luminous and beautiful. And all of this is totally shattered by society's rejection of him, and Frankenstein's ultimately rejection of him. The creature is different than everyone else, an outcast from society, which is a really common theme in romantic literature. Like you can see last year when we read The Scarlet Letter, Hester is a huge outcast in her little society. Everyone calls him a monster, and he slowly starts to believe that he is, in fact, a monster. And I think that this is what ultimately drives him to realize that he can kill, and he wants to kill. And it seems that today, actually it's seen a lot in Victorian literature, that orphans are a common theme, and orphans who are left to their own devices will not be inherently good, but they will actually find the inherent evil side of themselves and go out into the world and destruction and mayhem. And he's filled with emotion that he can't process because no one's there to show him how to process it, because it doesn't have any parental figures. So all of this emotion just exits as rage and violence. We have some quotes. Soon a gentle light stole over the heavens and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure, once again showing his wonder for the world. And when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification, showing that he does have the emotional capacity to process this, but he doesn't have the guidance to know what to do with it.
So, moving on to Walton, who was the last character we analyzed. In this story, Walton represents the blind and impressionable youth, just like a young Frankenstein. He too has this blind ambition and arrogance that's driving all of his actions, but he's given the opportunity to learn something from the mistakes of others, and that's what he gets from Frankenstein's story. So we start off with a quote that he says at the beginning of the novel, saying, "One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of knowledge, which I sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race." So this is something that's almost exactly like what Frankenstein says in his beginning of his story, and his quest to create man. But here Walton displays the same arrogance and carelessness that Frankenstein once did, and what led him to his despair. And then moving on, it says, You seek for the knowledge and wisdom as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been. I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale." And this is actually a quote spoken by Victor as he starts to tell his story, but it hints at a lesson to be learned, and it kind of foreshadows that Walton will learn something from this and not make the same mistakes that Frankenstein did.
So lastly, we wanted to bridge the gap a little bit between Romanticism and Gothic horror, because this is the book that bridged the gap between the two literary movements. So Gothic horror is a literary movement that it encompasses all of the themes of Romanticism, such as the truth in nature and the criticism of the norm. But it also ties the characteristics of fear, death, and gloom. And one of the most novels that are written like that. Dracula, you've probably heard of it. So Shelley's Frankenstein bridges the gap between them, and Frankenstein's life is shadowed by death. He first starting with his mother, and then going on to his brother, his friend, his wife, and ending with his own. And then fear is seen most prominently when the creature is first introduced. The quote we have is, "A cold dew covered my forehead, my teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed, when by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created." Which, honestly, reading that, it puts a little bit of fear into you, because it's pretty scary feeling to think about your limbs convulsing and waking up in a sweat. But it's almost a pleasing fear, as seen in Gothic horror, because you side with the creature, you feel pity for the creature throughout the entire novel. And Frankenstein's obviously is kind of a dick. Like, he's egotistical, sex isn't good enough for him, he can't like make a baby, he has to go make his own thing out of recycled parts. Like, I don't know. So, and then you can see that the spaces they're in, like, he takes place in, they live in a Gothic castle, and the apartment he occupies in Ingolstadt is gloomy and bare and poorly lit. So, and the creature has a lot of death because he kills a lot of people. Yay! Gothic horror.